Tony Blair as the colonial dictator of Gaza. This is the insane proposition being seriously promoted by Donald Trump and the like. Now, Blair is close to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has previously stated that Gaza waterfront property could be very valuable. I was on Good Morning Britain on ITV today debating this with Robert Clark, who's a defence fellow at the Yorktown Institute, which is a hawkish pro-war think tank.
And I like Tony. I've always liked Tony, but I want to find out that he's an acceptable choice to everybody.
So, what do you think? Could Tony Blair bring peace to the region? We'll give you the results of our phone poll on this in about 5 minutes. Meanwhile, former Labour supporter Owen Jones, who's writing a book on the Middle East, says that Blair just creates chaos in the region. But Iraq war veteran Robert Clark says the former PM has all the contacts to help end the conflict and move things forward. And I'd like to start with you. We've heard this morning that the Deputy President of the Palestinian Authority is also head of the PLO Executive Committee, so he carries a lot of weight. Hussein al-Sheikh, very happy, he says, to work with Tony Blair. If it's good enough for him, why isn't it good enough for you?
I've just come back from the West Bank, actually, travelling all around, and I have to say the Palestinian Authority is monstrously unpopular amongst Palestinians. There hasn't been an election to elect those who govern them for, nearly 20 years now. So I don't think that's representative of the Palestinian people at all. You know, I was in Iraq a few weeks ago, and when people found out I was British, they said things like, "You destroyed this country." I found myself apologising, even though I marched about 20 times against the Iraq war. Tony Blair presided over a wall sold on a pack of lies, which was illegal, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, both because of the direct military violence, but as was impressed on me, the sectarian bloodbath, which people very much squarely blamed on Western policy. My view is, I think, rather than being the colonial ruler of Gaza, he should be in The Hague, tried for war crimes. More importantly, though, that is the view of millions of people in the Middle East. And I just feel, let's be just a controversial view here, I think Palestine should be run by Palestinians with democratic elections for them to decide who rules them with their own state, their own homeland, not a colonial administration.
They had them and they ended up with Hamas.
Well, you mean in 2006 you had elections. The most popular person to take over in Palestine is someone called Marwan Barghouti, who is imprisoned by Israel. He would defeat, according to polls, both Hamas and Fatah, who rule overall, but they won't release him. He's the Palestinian Nelson Mandela.
OK, so when President Trump says, I'm going to consider whether Tony Blair is acceptable to everyone, clearly not acceptable to Owen, acceptable to you, Robert?
I think more acceptable than most. I think, look, we have to take emotion out of the equation here and be a bit more realistic in how we approach this, in the sense of who else is better qualified on the international circuit. You know, Tony Blair, like him or not, he has 20-plus years of diplomatic international experience. He has phenomenal contact with both business, political, charity, NGO elites across the region.
You served in Iraq.
I did.
Do you recognise Owen's description of that conflict?
I respect Owen's opinion about it. I think the difference is, whilst Owen marched, I fought. And I think the difference is, having been to the country and seen it firsthand in its worst days, and the memory of Tony Blair and the legacy of the British and the American war in Iraq isn't as one-sided as some people paint. I still speak to people in Iraq, people who I know, Iraqis, who have come to England as well since. And they're grateful, for example, the opportunities of Saddam Hussein being removed and a civil society returning to Iraq, which we can see, hopefully, the embers of starting in Gaza.
Do you think that Blair deserves a shot at redemption? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think it's a case of a shot at redemption. I think it's more a case of he is the practical option on board. He has phenomenal experiences in these issues. He was obviously the special envoy for the quartet. And just to counter a point against that, obviously Tony Blair was in that position for 7 or 8 years and there was no peace brought to Palestine or Gaza. That was because of the Palestinian Authority at the time. I think he has the experience to actually leverage those issues for the better.
I mean, you're right. I did march rather than fight. I marched so people didn't fight, and if we'd been listened to, then hundreds of thousands of people wouldn't currently be dead. In terms of his, Middle East peace envoy, talking about him being experienced, someone put this, and this is blunt, but someone put this rather eloquently, saying he's got experience in the Middle East, therefore he's well-suited, like saying Harold Shipman should run a care home because he has experience with elderly people.
Well, Tony Blair didn't run the Iraq war. He was instrumental in leveraging the political appetite for it.
The Chilcot inquiry, which is just memory hold by most people for some reason, found that he deliberately exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, but more importantly, relevant to this, he ignored warnings about what would happen in the aftermath. There was no planning for the chaos, the violent chaos.
But would you not argue that's the reason why his experience will be brought to bear in Gaza?
What you're saying,
the lessons are learned from history, where he won't be the same.
You're saying
making the same mistakes.
You're saying because he oversaw a catastrophe, he's best placed to learn from the catastrophe he caused. This is ludicrous. He also, by the way, in the run-up to that war, as the Chilcot inquiry found, wrote letters to George W. Bush saying, "I will be with you whatever." We saw what it was like when he deferred to a disastrous US president. Is he going to do the same with Donald Trump? I think most people would agree that's rather likely, given his history.
Over to you. We asked you all morning on X, formerly Twitter, is Tony Blair the right person, in your view, to bring peace to the Middle East? 17% of you said yes, 83% of you said no. So there's a huge, huge movement against the idea in this country.
Well, the poll is hardly surprising given how monstrously unpopular Tony Blair is. It was a very short debate, so here's some other key points. When he was Middle East peace envoy for the Quartet, that's the United Nations, United States, European Union and Russia, there were 3 murderous assaults on Gaza, as well as the devastating siege by Israel against its people. We can safely say that Tony Blair did not fulfill his job description. One Palestinian official at the time summed up his record succinctly: useless, useless, useless. Indeed, Palestinian negotiators said he spent much of his time lobbying at the United Nations against the establishment of a Palestinian state. He backed the violent military coup in Egypt, led by General El-Sisi in 2013, who massacred vast numbers of Egyptian protesters. That's because Blair sends us his worldview around the spectre of radical Islam, so clearly is willing to disregard human rights abuses in the process. Indeed, he even called for a pact with Vladimir Putin's Russia in 2018 in the fight against terrorism, as he puts it. Now, at the same time, his institute has received millions of pounds from the Saudi dictatorship, who behead their opponents and indeed chop up journalists in embassies, as well as exporting extremism abroad. He's not consistent, let's put it that way. Indeed, Tony Blair's institute has received vast sums of money from other murderous dictatorships, from Kazakhstan to the United Arab Emirates, which has sought to trash proposals for peace in Palestine, and more recently, of course, has been waging a genocidal war in Sudan. Another donor is Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, who's donated or promised hundreds of millions of dollars to Tony Blair's institute. He is a zealous supporter of Israel, who only donated to Marco Rubio's presidential campaign in the United States a decade ago on the proviso that he was a zealous himself cheerleader of Israel. Ellison's leading the takeover of TikTok's US operations, which is clearly being driven by desire to change the algorithm in the interests of Israel, because it's been blamed for giving pro-Palestinian content a platform and thus shifting public opinion in the United States against Israel. The whole thing is frankly abhorrent, dystopian. There are Palestinians who still remember languishing under British rule. Indeed, it's British rule which led to this whole disaster in the first place. This is just revamped colonialism, and it speaks to just how cheap Arab blood is considered in the West. Tony Blair can be one of the architects of one of the great catastrophes of the 21st century, which drowned Iraq in blood and chaos. Hundreds of thousands slaughtered, and from that chaos came ISIS, among other dire consequences. And then the West can arm and facilitate a genocide, wipe Gaza from the face of the earth, slaughter, plausibly again, hundreds of thousands of people, many of them children, blow up Gaza's hospitals, murder its medical staff, deliberately starve its people, subject people to mass kidnapping, which obviously isn't discussed because Palestinian hostages do not qualify as human beings in the eyes of the Western media, torture, rape, we could go on. And then they try and impose the architect of one criminal catastrophe in the Middle East on the survivors of another criminal catastrophe in the Middle East, both catastrophes designed, facilitated by the West. Well, again, here's a radical idea. Let Palestinians rule Palestinians. The West's crimes, which have caused so much bloodshed and chaos, must be stopped. And it's incumbent on those of us in the West to end those crimes. I mean, it's absurd. They brought us Afghanistan, and Tony Blair's fingerprints were all over that as well. That ended in catastrophe. Iraq, and also Libya, which Tony Blair actively supported again, a catastrophe. Over and over again, bloody catastrophes. And they walk from one crime scene to another. Clearly, their desire for blood not satiated. Well, again, why do we allow people who are responsible for criminal catastrophes over and over again when everything we've said was correct? We were proven right in the worst possible way, vindicated catastrophically, and yet we allow these criminals to just walk from crime scene to crime scene. Well, we should start in the West by fighting for accountability. And that means the likes of Tony Blair, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and all the rest tried at The Hague for the crimes they've committed. I don't care how utopian it sounds. Unless we get accountability, we're going to keep seeing these crimes committed over and over again. Please like and subscribe. Help us take on the calamitous media, which facilitates all these crimes at patreon.com/Owners84. Patreon.com/Owners84. You make all of this possible, it reaching millions across different media platforms. Share the video, leave your comments, subscribe. I think I've already said that. I'll speak to you in a bit.